This is Jim Cantelon Today television, Bible study for the 21st century. Welcome to Jim Cantelon Today television. I'm Jim Cantelon. It's always a joy to come your way, friends, and I know that a lot of you are faithful viewers. A little rough right now, what's happening in the world with COVID-19, and a lot of us are sheltering in place and maybe getting a little tired of it, but nevertheless, our spirits are solid because we have hope. Big part of that is Bible study, and we're looking at the Gospels. We're continuing with our study in Mark right after this break. Hang in there with us.
The Bible tells us that true religion is visiting orphans and widows in their distress. The Bible also says that God is a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows. Heaven's core values for mankind begin with God's heart for the least of these. When you support WOW, you're in the sweet spot of God's heart for the poor. Yes, we're only a small player in this great drama, but at least we're on the field. Please give generously.
So friends, we're continuing in the Gospel of Mark, and it's a terrific book for a number of reasons, one of them being that it was the first of the four Gospels to be written. If you do any study at all in the Gospels, you'll discover that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the synoptic Gospels, whereas John is kind of a standalone. You also will discover that Mark was the first of the Gospels written, and in many cases kind of set the bar, the standard, in terms of the not necessarily the chronology, but the essential components of Jesus' ministry. And Mark was mentored by Peter. In fact, Peter in his own epistles refers to Mark as a son, but the general feeling among scholarship is that Mark wrote Peter's recollections. And so as such, it's very accurate. It's very, in many cases, kind of blunt, straightforward. Not a lot of adjectives, not a lot of adverbs, not a lot of figurative language. And he kind of jumps from things, from point to point and from situation to situation. Not a lot of transition sentences. So it's a part of his style. But nevertheless, it's a really, really solid introduction to the life and ministry of Jesus. Last time we were on the Mount of Transfiguration, which is Mount Hermon in the northern part of Israel. It's right there on the border between Israel and Lebanon and Syria today. It's about 10,000 feet high. It gets about 40 feet of snow in the wintertime. You can actually ski and snowboard there. My own kids have done this. It's a beautiful mountain, and it kind of dominates the skyline. It's about 30 miles or so north of the Sea of Galilee on a long, steady climb from the Sea of Galilee up to Mount Hermon. It probably was an old volcano at one point, because most of the rock in that area is basalt rock, which is black rock, and it's an amazing mountain. Anyway, this is where the Transfiguration occurred, and we talked about that last time. I don't want to repeat myself, but I will say that this Transfiguration was so remarkable that it amazes me that Peter, James, and John, ever had any moment where they doubted or mistook or misstepped vis-a-vis Jesus, Son of God. And yet they did. Why did they not fully comprehend him, even though he was so close to them? It was because they had a religious nationalist view of messiahship. They had a certain kind of framework that they had been taught and they had dealt with. And Jesus, even though he intrigued them and seemed to be checking off more of the boxes, there were still a lot of things he was doing outside the box. they didn't really understand the Son of God concept. The Son of Man, on the other hand, was a messianic term, and they expected he'd establish a throne in Jerusalem, he would rule the world from Jerusalem, and that they would be the first ones in terms of being a governing cabinet. And we see that coming up again and again throughout the Gospels. So anyhow, this experience was phenomenal. Not only seeing Jesus there transfigured, with Elijah and Moses, but to hear the voice of the Father himself. It's hard to imagine just how impactful that situation was. Nevertheless, they're coming down from the mountain now. We'll pick it up here in Mark chapter 9. We're at verse 9. Coming down from the mountain, he commanded them that they should tell no one the things they had seen till the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Son of Man, remember, is a messianic title. So they kept this word to themselves, questioning what rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, saying, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" And he answered and told them, "Indeed, Elijah is coming first and restores all things. And how is it written concerning the Son of Man, that he must suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I say to you that Elijah has also come, and they did to him whatever they wished, as it is written of him." Now, this is a little awkward. Well, Jesus didn't believe in reincarnation by any stretch. The Bible doesn't preach reincarnation. So we got to put that out of our thinking. What Jesus is talking about here is a ministry of restoration that Malachi in chapter 4, verse 6 prophesied about the ministry of Elijah. And they're talking here, Jesus is talking here about John the Baptist. John the Baptist came in the spirit of Elijah. John the Baptist was the last, if you will, the Old Testament prophetic figures. And he's calling for repentance so that the covenant with Israel could sort of begin a long journey to renewal, culminating in Messiah's arrival. There was a lot there compacted into those few years of John the Baptist's ministry. But Jesus here is speaking with a kind of the sweep of history in mind. He's looking at the big picture here. And whenever you do that, there's a lot of gaps, and there's no sense trying to spin what's not there. We just deal with what is. Now, when I look at it, however, I see this. The disciples seem to be aware of Malachi's prophecy, and Jesus, in a kind of a kind way, is saying, "So why are you guys focusing on that? Why aren't you also focusing on the scriptures that talk about the Son of Man suffering many things and being treated with contempt?" Right here, must suffer many things and be treated with contempt. Why is that written there? It was sort of an offhand rebuke that, you guys are cherry picking prophecies. So you're all gaga about Elijah, but you don't seem to understand that the Messiah has got to go through a very, very difficult time. This always went over their heads. In fact, even when he's talking about resurrection, they don't get it. And there's nothing to indicate, at least in Mark's gospel, that the disciples were Pharisees, but they may have been influenced by the Pharisees. The disciples were Galileans. They were provincial. They were seen as kind of, blue-collar workers on the other side of the mountain, if you will. They didn't have the savoir-faire. They didn't have the sophistication and or even the education that a lot of those who lived in the major urban areas had, especially in Jerusalem. And the Pharisees, in most cases, were well educated. They had a very fixed theological worldview. They were parsim in the Hebrew, which means they were interpreters of the oral law that had been built over the centuries around the law of Moses. And they had a certain kind of set way of doing things. And there's no real indication that these Galileans were Pharisees. Now, when we get further on in the story, we're going to discover around the crucifixion, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea emerge, who both were Pharisees, who both were members of the Sanhedrin, which is the ruling civil council of Jerusalem. And Jesus had a definite appeal to some of these people on the higher level, if you will, of societal status. But nevertheless, they're wondering what in the world is going on with this business of resurrection. They didn't understand it. It says here just simply that they didn't know what he meant about it. So anyhow, moving right along. They get to the bottom of the hill. Now, let's go back to verse 14 here for a minute. When he came to the disciples, okay, they've come down the mountain, and the other 9 disciples are waiting for them. The other 9 disciples may have been a little bit out of joint at the special treatment, it seemed to them, that Peter, James, and John were getting. You had the 12, but then you had the big 3. And they keep emerging, Peter, James, and John, Peter, James, and John. They perhaps didn't like it, that Jesus, who's going to be Messiah, is favoring these 3 over the rest of us. Okay? And you'll see that emerging here in a minute. But he sees the disciples, and there's a great multitude and stir going on because of what he was about to do. They knew that there was this man with a son who was very troubled, waiting for Jesus. He'd obviously gone to the 9 disciples, asking them to heal him. And it looks like they tried without success. And this would add even more to their peak, if you will, at being not dismissed, but pushed to the side in favor of Peter, James, and John to go up the mountain. They were feeling, I'm sure, a little bit insecure. And so this guy says, look, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they couldn't. He answered them and said, O faithless generation, how long will I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? You see Jesus' exasperation there. Bring him to me. So they brought him to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him. He fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. So he, Jesus, asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? He said, from childhood. And often he has been thrown into the fire, into the water, to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Now, I'm running out of time for this segment, so I'm going to just stop there, and we'll take a little break, and I'll come back and continue. But you see what's happening here. You've got this amazing transfiguration, this amazing event where Jesus meets with the law and the prophets, Moses and Elijah, where the voice of the Father is expressed. I mean, this huge heavenly visitation. And now they're at the bottom of the mountain, ground zero, if you will, dealing with something as basic as a boy who's possessed by an evil spirit. We'll pick it up right after the break.
WOW works with local churches in needy countries. We mobilize those churches, pastors, and volunteers in a concerted effort to care for orphans and widows in their homes and villages. Through that strong faith-based platform, we're able to not only provide food, medicine, and crisis intervention, but we're also able to lead these afflicted ones to faith in God. It's powerful, humbling, and well worth the effort. Please support WOW with your generous gifts and faithful prayer. Thank you.
So let's pick it up here. Not a lot, but it's not uncommon when you're reading commentary on this passage to see symptoms here of a severe epilepsy. I think, to be fair, we have to acknowledge that in that time, it was not uncommon for the people to not only attribute illness to sin, but also to attribute things like epilepsy and convulsions and other kinds of things to evil spirit possession. I'm sure in some cases that was just their way of doing it, and they, with perhaps the knowledge that we have today, would have seen it otherwise. However, in this case, it's very clear that this is an evil spirit at work. Jesus acknowledges it. The evil spirit acknowledges Jesus. So let's not pretend it's not what it is. Okay, anyway, the kid's dad brings him to Jesus. And the crowd are gathering because they knew that this was going to come to a head. They had probably gathered round while the disciples, the 9 who remained at the bottom of the mountain, tried to heal him, tried to deliver him from this spirit possession without success. They knew that Jesus could do it. And so Jesus comes down and everybody's rushing to see what's going to happen, all right? So Jesus said to him, the Father, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more." The spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him. And he became as one dead, so that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we cast it out?" Now, if you've ever been to the Vatican Museum in Rome, like me and my wife, you probably have, walked through in wonder at what you're seeing there. Another place where so many of these amazing paintings exist is in the Louvre in Paris. I've often said if you were to remove all of the pictures that have biblical themes from the Louvre, it would be 2/3 bare. I mean, it's all Bible stories. And maybe you've seen Raphael's famous Transfiguration painting, and you can Google it, Raphael, R-A-P-H-A-E-L, Raphael Transfiguration painting, and you'll see what I'm talking about. You look at the picture, it's a classic picture, but he links the moment of Jesus' glorification with a group of concerned adults pointing and looking at a distressed boy, and they're both in the picture. And an artist being an artist, he has to kind of portray what was happening and what is happening in the same frame. So he's got Jesus and Elijah and Moses at the top of the picture, and he's got this crowd and this concerned father and this distressed boy at the bottom of the picture. And Raphael, in his artistic kind of way, was demonstrating the linkage between the heavenly and the earthly. But nevertheless, it's really important, I think, if not just for the sake of the boy, then for the sake of the 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, that Jesus, demonstrates to them that Peter's off-the-wall idea about building 3 tabernacles on Mount Hermon so that Jesus, Elijah, and Moses could stay there for all time was a totally boneheaded idea. That yes, it was a glorious experience. Yes, it was wonderful, but the rubber meets the road at the bottom of the mountain, and we got to get back to the ministry. And so in many ways, it demonstrated to these 3 that we are here to keep our feet on the ground for now, all right? You've seen who I am, where I'm heading, but we've got a sick boy to deal with here. And that's essentially what's going on. This affliction is created by an unclean spirit, and it was a difficult situation. There's no verbal recognition of Jesus, but Mark tells us when the spirit saw Jesus, he immediately convulsed the boy. And apparently, it looked like he killed him. But Jesus, who wasn't intimidated by anything demonic, good example to us, friends. No need to be afraid of evil. The Lord is protecting those in whom his spirit has indwelt from the evil one. guaranteed, all right? Jesus was total master of the situation, but he just basically heals the boy. There's something to notice here, though. Let's see, let's find it. Yeah, in verse 19, he answered him and said, this is after the boy's father said, I spoke to your disciples, they couldn't cast it out. He answered him and said, and you see exasperation. Oh, faithless generation, how long will I be with you? Why do I have to put up with this? Life is too short for this. How long shall I bear with you? Bring the boy to me. That's really kind of the tone that I detect in this passage. Jesus' patience is phenomenal. And when you see him, in this setting, being as patient as he was, and at the same time able to focus on the need of a young boy, it's just a tremendous example to us of how to kind of sort things through and keep things in perspective. Anyway, he heals the boy, and they move on. Now, when they were at the Mount of Transfiguration, and I pointed this out a few programs ago, they were camping out for a few days at the base of the mountain in a place near what's now called Banias, but it was Caesarea Philippi. It was a fairly cosmopolitan area, doing a lot of trade, and it was kind of the last jumping off spot, for those in Israel to move up into Lebanon, and conversely for those in Lebanon to come down into Israel, and then shooting off to the east through Syria. It was a very established city, beautifully situated, right in the foothills of Mount Hermon, at the point where the water that, comes from Mount Hermon in the spring, when those 40 feet of snow, melts, it goes down into the ground and resurfaces at the foothills in the Caesarea Philippi area. And when you're walking around there, as I've done many times, it's hard not to be walking in and through water. It's beautiful, ice cold, crystal clear water coming out there. And then it begins to flow down through the Hula Valley from the upper Galilee down into the lower Galilee, and finds its way to the Jordan River into the Sea of Galilee down into the Dead Sea, and then it evaporates. So that's where they had been. So now they're going to head back to Capernaum. And again, this is Mark. He just kind of transitions from one place to the next without any transition sentence. He doesn't tell you how long it took. Believe me, it takes a while. I used to drive from Jerusalem up to southern Lebanon every week when I pastored in Jerusalem, to do a couple shifts at a radio station there that was ministering the gospel to southern Lebanon and northern Israel. And, it would take me about 4 hours to drive from Jerusalem up to Metula, right on the northern border with Lebanon. And I drove down through the Jordan Valley, up past the Mount of Beatitudes, up into the upper Galilee, right past Caesarea Philippi, right up to Metula. And then with a military pass, I was allowed by the Israeli military into southern Lebanon to the radio station, which was kind of an abandoned customs house that had been made into a station. And so I know this area very, very well. The thing about it is, it's a long way. And to walk it, as Jesus and the disciples were doing, would take many, many hours. I think you could walk from Caesarea Philippi down to Capernaum in one day if you're really, really, it would take maybe 14 hours, maybe a little longer. And I expect they probably stopped, halfway down and camped out and then carried on the next day. They got a lot of time to talk when they're walking. And I see it in my mind's eye, it's a walking path, and they'd be stretched out, maybe sometimes even a half mile, stretch. Some at the front, some at the back, some in the middle, some in groups, some alone. I don't know where Jesus would be. He'd probably be at the back, sometimes. Anyway, here's what's going on. They're talking. And they're trying to figure out what Jesus means when he says this. He taught them, saying, "The Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and after he's killed, he will rise the third day." They didn't know what's going on with this one. You can be sure they talked about it. Couldn't figure it out. No idea. And this was not the only occasion. There were several occasions where Jesus would warn them about the fact that he was going to be arrested, that he was going to be tried, that he was going to die a horrible death, and that he would rise again. Anytime he got into this, it just seemed to go over their heads. It's just the way it was. Their whole focus was on essentially an ego-fueled religious nationalism with power as the end game. And you can say, well, you're being real hard on these guys. This was the reality, friends. They had an agenda. They couldn't understand the biblical agenda. And it took them a long time, indeed long after the resurrection, before they finally understood what was going on.
Why dance when you have very little? When you live from day to day with food insecurity, rampant disease, sickness, and death? You dance because your heart is full of love for God and your hope is strong. WOW has come alongside as the hands and feet of the Lord, providing both home-based care and assurance of God's love. You're happy and you've got to dance. Please support WOW. Let's keep them dancing.
Now, friends, about 3 times every program you see a promotion for WOW, Working for Orphans and Widows. This is a ministry that my wife and I began over 20 years ago. We're in our 21st year now. We began working with orphans and widows who've been impacted by HIV and AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. And we've been doing it faithfully now for 21 years. What we didn't realize when we began is that this would introduce us not just to the ravages of this horrible virus, but also to the ravages of just simple poverty. People with no food security and people who had very impacted immune systems, in many cases almost nullified by HIV and AIDS. And it has exposed us to a remarkable need. And so with wowmission.com, you can log on to wowmission.com, you'll see little updates on what we're doing there. But JCT represents WOW. WOW represents JCT. When you send your donation, ask for Cantelon's Casual Commentary. I'll send you one. You're going to really enjoy it. Thanks for watching.